I always remember when I would go along to the BBC News team with my latest initiative. And one time they said to me, why do you keep coming with these initiatives and just demotivating and depressing us? And I was like, but these things are supposed to make your life better. You should be thanking me. If we were product designers and we were producing widgets and people reacted to our widgets in the way that they react to our processes, they wouldn't show up, they didn't buy them, they didn't like them, they moaned about them. The response as a product manufacturer would not be, well, we must make them like it. We must put them on mandatory training so they understand how to use our product. You'd change the frigging product, wouldn't you? Nobody's buying this, nobody's using this. Let's change the product.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. When Lucy Adams was Director of People at the BBC, she faced unique challenges. It is a publicly funded news organization, so everyone in the UK feels they get to have a say in how it's run. And it's in the public eye every single hour of every day. Lucy would wake up each morning to check if anything on the front page of the national news was going to ruin her day. Now, despite her professional success in this crucible, over time, Lucy grew increasingly frustrated with HR's one-size-fits-all approach, which treated all employees under the same rigid policies. Determined to find a fresh perspective, she founded Disruptive HR, which is an innovative agency that inspires leaders and HR professionals to approach their roles with a very different vision and renewed energy. In this episode, Lucy and I talk about the challenging forces that act on heads of talent and chief people officers, Lucy's experience being cross-examined by Parliament about her personnel decisions, and emerging disruptions in HR. We also dive into the EACH model, which views employees as adults, consumers, and human beings. The three major benefits of the consumerization of the workplace, the difference between equity and equality at work, humanizing performance management, as well as other topics. Now, if you find today's conversation insightful, please subscribe so you can know when new episodes are released. And now, I'm excited to bring you my conversation with Lucy Adams. Lucy Adams, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thank you so much, Dart. Great to be here.
So I spent a lot of the last week deeply involved in your book, HR Disrupted. And I found so much commonality and so much kindred in what I was reading there. And we're going to get into it. We're going to get into the details of that book, HR Disrupted. But before we do that, I want to talk. So you were the Director of Talent for the BBC.
Director of People was my title, but
Director of People.
Same stuff, yeah.
Still a better word. I like that, Director of People. So you were Director of People at the BBC. And I want to talk about the forces that act upon somebody at that level of leadership in a people role and how they challenge you, how they affect you, and how you thought about it.
I think the best way to get into that is to describe how my day used to start. So my day used to start, it was a BlackBerry when we had BlackBerries. And I would be awake at around 6:30. And the first thing I would do after hitting my alarm would be reach for my BlackBerry and I would look at the media clippings. So I would be looking at what was in the press, the media about the BBC that day. Now, any other HR role, HR director role that I've had, I've never started with looking at what the press is saying about us. It might form part of a paper or something you might think about at some point during the month, but every morning I would be looking at it and that would shape my day. So I might have had great strategic plans. I might have had fantastic initiatives on the go. But if there was an article in the Daily Mail or the Daily Express, two of the newspapers here in the UK that were particularly vocal about the BBC's failings or perceived failings, if there was an article about something to do with executive pay, severance terms, pensions, I mean, it could be anything to do with people, then that would shape my day. There would be an immediate emergency meeting. There's a spoof documentary here in the UK, which is about the BBC. I couldn't watch it for a little while because it was too triggering for me because it was basically my life. But they had this meeting in this spoof comedy documentary, which was called the Daily Damage Limitation Meeting. And that's what we had at 9:30. And the reason we had it at 9:30 was because our boss, the Director General at the time, didn't get in from his house in Oxford until that time. So at 9:30, we'd have the Daily Damage Limitation Meeting. And it would be what is being said about us, what can we do, how can we respond? So in answer to your question, I think as much as I would have attempted to be strategic, to look to the future, what in fact happened was that my reaction shots became really good. So I became incredibly good at spotting stuff, reacting to it, putting in place some kind of emergency response. That's not great, though, for thinking about the long-term future of the people and the organization.
No, it's not. I don't think that's an unusual environment. In other words, it's not a unique environment, but it is an unusual environment in the sense that, so first of all, the BBC is wholly supported by the government?
Well, it's supported not by government, but by what's called the license fee. It's a tax on people who own a television. Now, that obviously is under review because, of course, people watch things on iPads. And so they've had to look at different ways of phrasing it. But in essence, if you're an adult in the UK, it is presumed that you're probably going to watch television and that therefore you should pay for the BBC. So it's a kind of universal tax on adults in the UK and families in the UK.
Which changes the dynamic in a lot of ways of leading a company like that or an organization like that, which is, first of all, everybody feels like they can have a say in what you're doing because they're paying for you. You're a public good. You're not like the public good, like, I don't know, you're not like the energy department in the United States because it's fairly secretive and kind of in the background. You're a public good that is absolutely in the public eye and is talking about things every day that people are going to disagree about.
I think that's absolutely right. Everybody has an opinion about the BBC. Typically, those opinions, they rarely are held by the same people. So they vary enormously. So everybody has their favorite show. Everybody has the show that they hate. Everybody has the presenter that they like. Everybody disagrees. So it's absolutely a topic of national debate. And that's great because when you work there, you're working for an organization that matters. You know, for the first time, I didn't have to tell my parents where I was working. They got it. They understood it. I didn't have to explain it. It really matters. And I've loved the BBC all my life. So there's a real plus to that. What you find, though, quite often in the UK is that people have a very, very positive view of the BBC output. So it's news programs, it's television programs, it's radio, it's online. People tend to think quite favorably about that, but they have quite a negative view of the BBC as an organization. So the suits that run it. And you're quite right when you say they are paying for the organization's salaries. They are paying for the content. They own it. They absolutely own it. And I think what's fascinating, and another facet of the challenges that I think people in organizations that are in the public eye, are funded by the public, but also have to compete in the commercial sector. Because we weren't going to lose great people to the energy department. We were going to lose them to Sky, to Netflix. We were going to lose them to commercial broadcasters who were paying significantly more money than we were paying. But the benchmark for BBC salaries is not necessarily regarded as being other commercial broadcasters. The benchmark is what are other people in the public sector getting? So you've got this dilemma where you're trying to compete in the commercial sphere, but you're also trying to adhere to the public standards of what's acceptable in terms of things like remuneration or behavior. And when you get that wrong, or where they perceive you get it wrong, there's a really visceral reaction from the public. And I think that was, when I look back at my time there, things that I did that I probably was okay with and other things that I regret. The things that I regret is when I got the balance wrong, where I focused more on us being competitive in terms of talent, retaining great people, than thinking about the public perception of what is fair and decent and right for the BBC.
That dynamic that you're talking about. Now, normally when I do research on somebody I'm going to be interviewing, I don't get to look at congressional hearings. And you were in something that looked a lot like a congressional hearing.
Yeah.
Maybe you can explain the background on that instead of me. And by the way, I'm going to tell you in advance, I thought you did a fantastic job. And I say this as somebody who used to professionally have to go on the stand to testify. So what was the background of you landing in front of that hearing?
Right. So very, very quickly, the backdrop to me appearing at, as you would describe, a congressional hearing in our language, it's a public accounts committee, but in essence, a subcommittee of government, of parliament, that is we call it cross-party or cross-bench mix. So it's all different parties represented, around about sort of 12, 15 members of parliament who are on this public accounts committee. And they would be holding organizations to account for in what they had perceived as being spending money in the wrong way. The reason that I was there was because there was a period of time where we were under a lot of pressure as an organization. You know, you couldn't pick up a newspaper or see a television interview without there being something about executive pay at the BBC being too high, too many managers. I think helpfully our ex-chairman described us as having more managers than the Chinese Communist Party. These kind of ridiculous comparisons that were put up there. So we were under a lot of pressure as an executive team to get those numbers down, which is what we did. You know, like a good HR person, we've got to get rid of some of that middle management, senior managers. And we took senior and middle management down by a third in terms of numbers. Unfortunately, these 200 people had very lengthy contracts. They'd been with the organization. And this is something that I know that the people in the States will be going, they were paid what in terms of severance? But sometimes their contract of employment would dictate a severance payment of up to 18 months money, maybe even 2 years money. So we were paying people what they were owed. And this is where my misunderstanding and miscalculation around what would be deemed as fair versus the commercial aspect. In my mind, I'm looking at the kind of overall bill. How much are we going to save from these people's salaries? What's the payback period once we've paid the severance? How can we sweeten the deal occasionally so that we can get them to go quietly? We can get them to go without causing a huge amount of disruption. And so a range of small increments were made on top of what they were expected to get contractually.
That would be unusual for regular employees in the United States, but not for executives.
No, it's completely normal for executives here in the UK and Europe too. Yeah, we call it the compromise agreement. It's a completely established practice. But the MPs, members of parliament, didn't feel this was the case. So regardless of the fact that actually within 15 months, we were saving the organization money, we were paying them largely what they were contractually entitled to, there was a big scandal around this. And so myself, my chairman and my director general, which is the BBC's equivalent of a CEO, we had to go along and answer questions, which is what you've been looking at on YouTube. I had to go twice, actually. And it was a pretty grueling, brutal experience. I mean, I think your analogy with a prosecution in a legal environment is a really good one, because it felt quite often when I was there that I was being faced by 12 or 15 prosecutors with absolutely no defense attorney. You know, it was kind of really full on. And it was a very, very difficult experience to go through. So bless you for saying that you felt that I'd performed well. I didn't think I performed well at all, but it was very, very difficult because, as you know, in congressional hearings, they're not necessarily trying to get to the truth. They're trying to get a headline quite often.
That's right. It's largely performative. In fact, I see this all over the place. I see it in layoffs in companies where they're making billions of dollars more than last year, but they're doing layoffs this year. And why is that? And sometimes I see it as performative for shareholders or for the board. And so there's this thing where there is a level of performative behavior that happens whenever things are public. And so I wanted to bring that up. And I wanted to bring it up because, first of all, for the chief people officers out there, that's like your worst nightmare, right? Which is that you're going to get grilled in public about decisions that you made, which can look bad, even though they might even be normal. But I also wanted to, before we got into the challenges of running the HR organization or people organization, I wanted to put it in the context of those kinds of pressures. In your book, HR Disrupted, the first section is about the kinds of disruptions that are coming at people organizations right now. But since you first wrote it, that has not slowed down. So what are some of those things that are forcing us to think differently about the people organization?
Well, I think that there are just the obvious ones. I think the obvious ones would be just the pace of change, the digital disruption, financial volatility. So even if you're having a good period, can you guarantee that this is going to last? So I think that's something that we're having to get used to. The fact that geographical and departmental boundaries don't make as much sense as they once did. So the need to work across those departments and teams and to work with people that we don't know and maybe we don't trust. And certainly we had plenty of that going on at the BBC, where the old days, it was very much leaders were responsible for their budget, their part of the organization, their audience. Whereas suddenly, is television, is it a broadcast product or is it an online product? Well, of course, it's both now. So you had teams who had to work together in very, very different ways. But then I think there's perhaps some other disruptions that are less well articulated or less well understood. I think loss of trust, I think, is a really big one. This sense that year on year, we see this dilution of trust in leadership, trust in our so-called betters and elders, and the rise of trust in people like us. I think there is a big piece around the reduction in attention span. And what does that actually mean for how we learn and how we grow? Clearly, since COVID, there has obviously been the rise of hybrid. So I think there's a whole raft of changes. But the key thing is that it isn't linear. I think the days when we used to be able to plot a change that was coming on a Gantt chart with a beginning, a middle, and an end, those days are gone. I think it's now non-linear. Very often we're dealing with competing priorities, huge levels of ambiguity, and it's relentless. So my view is that it's not so much about what the changes are, but it's about what are organizations trying to do, what are leaders trying to do, what are HR directors trying to do. And I think they're trying to create the conditions where their people can be four things: more agile, more productive, more collaborative, and more innovative. Those are the four that stand out to me, regardless of what the individual topic of disruption is. It's in essence, they're trying to create the mindsets, the attitudes, the behaviors, the coping mechanisms where people can be more agile, productive, collaborative, and innovative.
On this show, we've been exploring the principles of multi-sided management, which is the belief that work is a product that every company builds and delivers to employees. This struck a nerve. Work for Humans is in the top 5% of podcasts worldwide. And along the way, people began to approach us, asking us how they could put multi-sided management into practice. And they were from all walks of business: line managers and CEOs, 3-person startups and multinationals and universities. But they all shared in common the belief that management practices of the last century are clearly not working. In response to this demand, I've pulled together a small team of some of the best people I have ever had the privilege to work with during my long career, who are also passionate about multi-sided management. And we formed a company 11-fold to serve the need. If you want your employees to feel more alive at work, you want happier teams, lower turnover, and you want tools that traditional management failed to give you to balance the needs of the company and the needs of your teams, let's talk. Employees give your company value it cannot survive without. When you fail to design great work, they will unsubscribe, either by leaving or even worse, by losing the ability to care. Join us at 11fold.com, spelled 11FOLD. Let's change management. In some ways, it's quite similar to a conversation I had with Ashley Goodall recently, who wrote the book, The Problem with Change. And what he wrote about there was that, first of all, some percentage of the change is not being inflicted upon us. Some percentage of the change we are inflicting upon ourselves and is not necessary. But for the stuff that is necessary, we need to create an organization that is robust enough to be able to function through the change effectively. And that should be the role of HR. So you propose a solution to this, which I find very compelling, which is the EACH model. And it's so funny. I'm going to just say what EACH stands for. Treat employees as. That's where the E comes from. I kept losing what the E was. I was like, wait, what's the E? No, it's the employees as adults, consumers, and human beings. And I agree with putting the E on there because the ACK model wouldn't have been as good.
Exactly.
But the EACH model, and what this is it's a touchstone that you can use making every single decision about people in an organization, which is you can go back to it and you can say, are we treating people like adults? Are we recognizing them as consumers? And are we recognizing them as human beings? Did you start your career with this model in mind? Or was it something that you had to learn the hard way?
I think a bit of both, actually. I think that, like many of us, I came to HR not through the usual training process or administrative business partnering role. I came from sales, winning bids, managing the transfer of people as part of that contract, and ended up in HR, like I think a lot of us do. I think I've been quite fortunate in that I came with a set of beliefs into HR that seem to be at odds with some of the more traditional assumptions. I used to really struggle, having been a leader and a manager outside of HR myself, when I would hear my team talk about they being the managers, they being the employees, they won't do it, they can't be trusted. And this just felt really uncomfortable to me. So I think I was lucky enough to not have come through a traditional route that I think schools HR in a number of assumptions and beliefs, and therefore ways of doing things. I was lucky not to have gone through that. However, as I came into HR, I wanted to do the right things. I knew I didn't have an HR background. And so there was plenty of materials out there, senior HR people who I worked alongside, who told me how to do performance management, how you had to have an engagement survey, the value of the 9-box grid in talent reviews, all of these established processes that I have introduced, that I have told managers will work. So whilst there was a nagging doubt in my mind, everything I criticize in the book, I have done. There is no higher moral ground here. So I think a bit of both.
That's what I say on stage too. I say, whenever I sound like I'm throwing rocks at HR, understand who I'm throwing them at. That's me.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about adult. Treat employees as adults. What's the alternative?
Well, the alternative is what we do all day, every day in most organizations, which is that we parent them. We parent employees, we parent managers, we parent leaders. And the parenting takes two forms, as I say in the book. There is the caring parent, which is where we try and do stuff for them, like We put up notices in the toilets, in the washrooms, now wash your hands. We spoon feed them with career ladders and career development support. We have conversations, difficult conversations with employees that managers should be having. We have managers saying to us, I couldn't do it without you. And then you realize you've just written up the notes from that disciplinary hearing, in terms of what is it that we're actually doing. So that nursemaiding that goes on, where our starting point is that we must protect and look after the people that work for us. It comes from a good place, but I think it's incredibly corrosive. And then we have the critical parenting. And this is where we try and protect the organization from the badly behaved employees, the tiny percent of people who actually are going to behave badly, but we design pretty much everything we do around them to prop up bad managers, to prevent badly behaved employees abusing our trust and doing wrong by the organization. So whenever I'm talking to large groups of HR people, or I still get emails from people all over the world, this is the one where they go, oh God, it's so true. It is so true. We parent them. And sometimes I think in HR, we've got our sense of value and self-esteem from that. We want to be helpful. And whilst we might not like it when we walk into a room and people say, oh, hush, the HR person's here, actually, there's a little bit of status and kudos that comes from being that compliance officer, the critical parent that I think some of us, not all of us, some of us have grasped in the absence of any other real influence. So I think that the fear of leaders, of letting go of the reins, the command and control environment that we've seen in organizations for decades has put HR into this slightly codependent relationship where we're looking after people, we're making them comply with stuff, making them do stuff, designing around the lowest common denominator. And that is so damaging to the organization. What are we getting with that? We're getting passive, compliant people. But back to where we started this conversation, which is around the need for agility, the need for innovation and so on, that's not going to help us thrive in that new world. Passive and compliance is not going to cut it.
I really see what you're describing there, which I haven't thought completely through, which is that I have a job if I'm in HR and I need to, for instance, justify my job, find value in myself, in my job. And the more that I can stand myself up as a protector, or that everyone else is a problem and I'm the one who's the bulwark against that problem, the more I have a job and the more I feel that I'm important in the organization. But it's founded on contempt. I can't remember who it was who said the 4 horsemen of a bad relationship, that the worst one is that if you see it in a relationship, that relationship is going to end. It's contempt. And so there's this idea that this infantilization of the organization that is caused by parenting, that is based on distrust. So the alternative is trust and giving responsibility to people to do the right thing and to take ownership of their careers. If I'm in HR, did I just become less valuable?
There's always that worry, isn't there, that if managers are actually managing, then what will they need us for? And I think the exciting thing for us is that if we are able to have line managers managing people, then what we can do is we can focus on creating the conditions where people can do their best work. So I don't think we'll ever be out of a job. I just think the job gets more interesting, it gets more challenging. And I think that that will frighten some HR people because it's easier to tell the manager what the policy is than coach them to use their judgment and to weigh up context and precedent and capability and to know what's going to work with this particular leader or manager. So it's easier and, in my view, much less satisfying to be the expert who tells them what to do and tells them off for not doing it. I think if we start to move, and this is something that we're starting to see now, HR using those consultancy skills, seeing their role as to equip leaders and managers to be able to use their judgment, to have those conversations, to articulate their decisions and arrive at an adult to adult solution that works for the team, the customers, the individual and them. That's really exciting. That's a really exciting role.
Yeah, it's less of a defensive play and putting your finger in the dike and making sure that the flood doesn't come. And it's much more about building capabilities for the organization to self-heal, to keep building itself stronger. It's a compelling idea.
I mean, I imagine that there'll be people listening to this who are in HR roles now who'll be thinking, oh, this is just crazy talk, because I have a bunch of managers and leaders who are completely inept when it comes to managing people. And if we leave it to them, then we're going to end up with chaos. We're going to lose all our talent. And so a lot of HR people that I meet feel stuck, that they can't possibly let go. They can't possibly allow employees to be at the mercy of these poor managers. So we create processes that make them do stuff to try and make them better leaders. And I just think our time would be much better spent working with the ones who can or could, and looking at how we hire and promote better people leaders in the future. Because I just think this propping up compensation for poor leaders is just soul destroying. And we make them do stuff which they do badly, begrudgingly. If we just take the annual performance review as a classic example, all of that is not based around how to improve someone's performance. If our starting point was improving performance, we wouldn't start with what we've got. Our starting point is that we don't trust managers to manage. We don't trust them to have conversations. We don't trust them to have proper conversations. And so what we'll do is we'll make them give a rating, then we'll make them follow a normal distribution curve. And how is that experience benefiting anybody?
We're going to get into that. In fact, I think right after we get through the each model, we're going to hop down to performance, because I do think it's such a prime example. So the C in each is consumer. What does that mean? Why does it matter?
This is something that you asked me earlier, did I come to HR with these views or did I learn them the hard way? And this is definitely learning the hard way. So like every other good HR person, I went along with the line, employees are our greatest assets. What a horrible expression that is. Assets are buildings, cars, computer equipment, and they largely behave in similar ways. Whereas we deal with human beings, beautiful, wonderful, incredible, frustrating, annoying, mercurial, messy human beings. And yet what we do is we apply this asset mentality, this asset approach to people in the workplace. And I absolutely did this. So one size fits all, universally applied. And I would feel really proud of myself when I had got a universal process for, say, onboarding or performance or talent. When I'd got everybody doing the same thing, I would feel good. I would feel proud because I had rolled it out. I had been efficient. I could then monitor it. I could ensure compliance with it. What I completely ignored and neglected to look at was what impact was it having? How is it relevant for the very different types of people that we had in our organization, for the different business units? When I left the BBC and went on to set up Disruptive HR, I spent a lot of time looking at other disciplines because I knew I wasn't going to find huge amounts of different and innovative approaches within HR. So I looked at advertising, marketing, and it struck me that product designers, advertisers, marketeers are trying to do with customers what we're trying to do with employees. They're trying to change perceptions, change behaviors, and increase brand loyalty. Now, we call it mindsets or attitude shifts or skill development, or we call it retention, staff retention. But in essence, it's the same kind of things. And we can learn so much by thinking and learning from and adapting what marketing are doing with customers. We can do the same with our employees. And so the consumer piece, which has grown and grown, and I think is Again, this is another area that I find very exciting because we're really starting to see this happen now. This horrible word, but consumerization of the workplace, where if I'm in my human life and I want to go and buy a sweater, then I want choice. I want my needs to be met. I want different price points, sizes, colors, styles. So why would I expect a one size fits all experience when I go to the workplace? Why wouldn't I want my needs met? The HR person, you mentioned contempt earlier, and we used to be contemptuous in some organizations I've worked in when leaders would say, but we're special and different. And we'd go, oh, they're all special and different. And we'd be so dismissive of it. But actually they were. They all had their own individual needs, their own business unit needs. And I, as an HR director, and I know many HR directors, are largely ignoring that. So the ability to provide choice, the ability to understand who you're catering for, who you're providing for, and to design, develop, produce, and market and sell HR products. And I know because I read your brilliant article in the Harvard Business Review on this, that you share some views around this, is if we can start to develop this product mindset, it can be transformational for us in HR.
I'll tell you, one of the things that really we have missed is that a lot of what we have designed when we set out to change the experience of work has been the box that work comes in. It's the wrapper. It's not the work itself. And so much of what we need to design is the work and the route to market for the work. And so this is where I found so much unbelievable commonality in what you wrote in HR Disrupted. And so I'm going to quote a little bit of it here, which is treating employees as consumers leads to 3 major benefits. Now, it's interesting, customer versus consumer. I'm not sure they're very, very different words. I think that they're mostly aligned.
Can I just explain why I use the word consumer?
Yeah.
Because I was thinking about the people who would be reading it, largely HR people. And I knew that if I put customers, there would immediately be this, oh, you're going to say that the customer's always right and we've got to give customers what they want. And that's not actually what I'm necessarily saying. I'm saying that we need to try and meet their needs more effectively, but not that they're always right. I refer back to the A in the each model. You know, it's not anarchy. It's not a hippie commune. It's not about giving them all everything they want. They're grown-ups. It's through conversation, and they might get some of what they want, but at least we're making that as a deliberate choice. So I went with the words consumer because I thought maybe I could try and circumvent that pushback.
And I have absolutely had that pushback. And it is true that the word customer, it triggers a lot of ideas about what that means. This thing, customers are always right. Customers are not always right.
No, they're not.
If I'm a banking customer and I want to go in and say, give me more money than I deserve, that's not right. The customers who are right is the customer who says, my food's too cold, because it's an opinion. And of course, you can't say no. In fact, I've been in this conversation in Italy. Went to dinner with an Italian in an Italian restaurant, and he got in a big argument with the waiter about the temperature of the wine. The wine is too cold. It's the same temperature it always is. And so anyway, that's where the customer is right, but it's never been true that the customer is right about everything. And then we get into this discussion, which is really kind of not the point.
Yeah, exactly.
And now we have to fight about what a customer is. So consumer has some real advantages. I completely agree. So treating employees as consumers leads to 3 major benefits. 1, deep insights into your people. Consumer research. You're understanding what your customers want so you can design better products for them. We can talk about the word product too. That's a topic of another discussion. A movement away from one size fits all approach, which, yeah, today it's like going to a shoe store and they say, here's your box of shoes. You don't get to try them on and you don't get to pick the style, and you just walk away and you try to put them on your feet. Procedures and processes are designed around employees rather than HR, which is, by the way, everything you say in this section about employees or consumers is about getting into the first-person perspective of somebody experiencing the work, which is a deeply design-oriented approach. Do you get pushback on, let's talk about either of the first 2, A and C of each?
Oh, huge amount. Actually, much more pushback on the adult piece, interestingly. But I suspect it's that the consumer one just feels too difficult, so they don't even go there. The adult piece is actually, there's always lots more conversation and interest, excitement, and anxiety about the adult piece. The consumer piece, I think they, by and large, get it when I'm talking to HR people, but equally they worry about it in a number of ways. They worry, first of all, that bringing in choice is going to be too complex, too confusing, and too expensive. So easier and cost effective to do one size fits all. And secondly, they worry about discrimination, being unfair. If you don't treat everybody exactly the same, then you can't possibly be fair. Both of those, I think, is worth spending a little bit of time on, because let's look at the two. So we've got the complexity cost of choice, and being fair means you have to be consistent. So the complexity and choice piece, I think absolutely, if you've got 1,000 people in your organization and you're going to bring in 1,000 ways of doing onboarding, that could be problematic. But of course, that's not what I'm talking about. And I know it's not what you're talking about. Where I think we can go with this are two things. Firstly, the use of employee persona. And we're seeing this more and more. So looking at your organization in the same way that a marketeer or a product designer would be looking at their customer base or their consumer base and saying, what are the types of buyers that we've got here? What are the types of needs and motivations and wants and pain points that they have? And usually we're talking about 3, maximum 4 persona. So providing choice from the center, from HR, not the flex benefits thing where we just throw the kitchen sink at it and hope that some of it will stick. I've got mixed my metaphors there, but you know what I mean. But deliberate, careful provision of choices based around a real in-depth understanding of the kind of people. So we see this with Starbucks. I think I mentioned this in the book. They looked at what's the motivation for working at Starbucks? Why do people work here? And you had persona 1 would be, they called it the careerists, right? The ones who are ambitious and they want to get on. And then they had what they call the artistes. And those were people who were interested in working in their local coffee shop. But it was all about their local community, that particular coffee shop, their team. They didn't particularly want to move around. And then the third persona, motivation for working at Starbucks, they called them the skiers. They were going to go skiing at the weekend with the cash that they were earning. You can't have one size fits all career development, learning and development, performance management for those kind of different persona and different motivations. So it's about providing deliberate, thoughtful choices. The next way that we can do it without importing huge amounts of complexity and cost is to give managers insights into who their people are or help them to develop their own insights. And I love these simple techniques like Thrive Global do it, where when you join and you're going through onboarding, you are asked, tell us about a time when you were rewarded at work and what did it mean to you? What was the best reward and recognition you ever had at work? And so you're beginning to build up these personal user manuals, personal preference manuals, whatever you want to call it, where the leader, the better leaders, have at last got some insight about how to adapt their style to get the very best from those people that work for them. So I think there's absolutely ways we can bring in choice and move away from one size fits all without it being overly complex and overly costly. And I do think we need to ask the question, how much are we spending on these low impact, irrelevant processes that we're rolling out currently? So that's the cost complexity. And then the second piece, which I just find fascinating, is this adherence to this idea that we have to treat people the same. We have to be consistent to be fair, because I couldn't disagree more. We all experience things in very different ways. Of course, we want to make sure that people have similar experiences. So we want us both, we're both working somewhere, we both want to feel valued, we both want to feel listened to, we both want to feel motivated. But how we achieve that is going to be very different for you or for me. You might really value the big public shout out, whereas for me, the best reward and recognition you could give me is actually to give me some time off because I've got parents I need to look after and kids. And so actually, why are we sticking to this view? We don't do this in our human lives, that you have to be consistent to be fair. We wouldn't treat our 16-year-old daughter the same as our 9-year-old son. We intuitively know that human beings need different things from us. In fact, we're more fair because we're really thinking about what matters to that individual rather than what's the standard policy, what's the standard process. One of my favorite anecdotes of where HR has applied, you've got to be consistent to be fair, and got it hugely wrong. It was actually a police force in the north of England. There was this really great, high-performing, really talented individual and very senior. And he'd gone to the HR team and said, look, I'm going to be donating bone marrow, something I want to do. It's a 1 to 2 week recovery time. And I was just wondering if I had to use all my annual leave or whether I could get some additional leave for this. And HR's response was, no, you can't, because if we gave it to you, everybody will be doing it to get the extra leave. And it's like, no, they won't. We apply these, we've got to be consistent to be fair, things like return to work interviews. We know that this person, because we've worked with them for a long time, and we know that they were genuinely sick because we know them. Whereas this person has had Mondays and Fridays off for the last 3 months. We know that that's something that needs to be handled in a different way. And yet we apply these return to work interviews regardless. I could go on and on and on with examples. I'll shut up. But I do think that if this assumption that we have to be consistent to be fair holds us back in HR, and I think it's something we need to discuss and we need to challenge, and therefore we can equip managers with the ability to use their judgment.
There's so much in there. And a part of it is, in all of this, you're starting off with the premise is, the world is not what you think it is. In other words, you're not dealing with reality when you apply approaches, for instance, that treat everybody as the same. Everybody is not the same. One of the ways I say that is, every human in your company is bigger than your company. They are a more complex thing than your entire company. And also challenge the idea that employees are inside. So part of it is just, look, you're not dealing with reality when you take these approaches. In the case of cost and complexity, to say this can't be solved, well, we solve it for products all the time. Companies solve it for products all the time. Shoes, cars, we have product lines, and it's clearly a solvable problem. It's just, we may not be resourced sometimes to do it, admittedly, not like the product organizations are. But like you said, if we can trust and not hold, for instance, managers in disrespect, we can distribute the responsibility so that it can be applied locally and with mindfulness for what people really want. And then the second part is, fair. It's the difference between equity and equality. Equity is responsive to the differences in people and working to create equivalence, not equality. So I will tell you one of my reasons why I think this hasn't been done, this sort of thing, very much. And it's largely because HR is responding to the demands of the senior team. And the senior team sometimes has a simplified model of the world that HR is trying to act upon. And if the senior team were to ask for work to be treated like a product, I think HR would do it.
I think this idea of leaders or organizations wanting simplicity and clear-cut answers and certainty, in my view, is one of the real dilemmas of organizations today. Because, as we know, individuals are incredibly complex. They've all got their backstories and their motivations, and they don't turn up on Monday and are still the same the following Monday and the Monday after that and the Monday after that. People shift and move. So employees are incredibly complex. And I think this view that we can provide certainty in HR, whether that be around potential ratings or engagement scores or processes that will achieve X, Y, and Z, or policies that will ensure safety. And I just think we're not being realistic here. We know that these things don't work in our human lives, in our home lives, in our friendships. And yet somehow we seek them out. And I agree with you. I think, quite often the board of a company will say, just tell me who our stars are, or tell me what the engagement score is, as opposed to really wanting to get into the complexity of this. It's just easier. And yet the great HR people that I meet and that I really respect are very comfortable with the fact that people are messy and great HR is messy. The minute you start going down numbers to someone's performance in a whole year, or a box that they're put in for potential and performance, or an engagement score, the minute you start simplifying it down and trying to provide certainty, you are ignoring the complexity of the world that you live in, the complexity of the individuals. And so great HR is messy. And I think it takes real courage to stand up as an HR professional and to say, no, I'm not going to give you these neat solutions because they're not real.
So I had Bill Hurst on the show. He's an Oxford or Cambridge, I'm going to get in trouble over that, political scientist. We were talking a lot about how governments have a tendency to try to oversimplify situations so that the people can be governed. It's a very similar problem. And that's why I wanted to have him on the show. Well, he told me a story, a Greek myth about Procrustes, who was this innkeeper. And if you went to his inn, he had a bed. And if you were too long for the bed, he would squish you down until you died. And if you were too short for the bed, he'd stretch you till you were dead. And if you were too wide, he'd cut off your sides until you were dead. And so he was kind of a demon, right? This Procrustes.
I've not heard that. That's brilliant. And there are some parallels there, aren't there? There are definitely some parallels. I always remember when I would go along to the BBC News team with my latest initiative. And one time they said to me, why do you keep coming with these initiatives and just demotivating and depressing us? And I was like, but these things are supposed to make your life better. You should be thanking me. And I think it's fascinating, this product concept, because if we were product designers and we were producing widgets and people reacted to our widgets in the way that they react to our processes, and they wouldn't show up, they didn't buy them, they didn't like them, they moaned about them, the response as a product manufacturer would not be, well, we must make them like it. We must put them on mandatory training so they understand how to use our product. You'd change the frigging product, wouldn't you? You would just go, Pete, nobody's buying this, nobody's using this. Let's change the product. And yet that's not what we do.
And you definitely wouldn't moralize about it. You wouldn't say, well, people these days are just lazy. They're too lazy to buy my product.
Yeah.
That's not what you do. You say, I better design a better product or I'm going to go to business.
And in my experience, most leaders, if you give them something that makes their life a bit easier, that helps them retain great people, that means that they get better performance and hit their results, they will bite your hand off. So if they're not biting our hand off, either our products are too cumbersome to use or they don't deliver the results. And I suspect it's both.
So let's actually go and look at performance management for a minute. So we talked a little bit about it with the adult piece, which is that a part of it is we don't trust managers to manage. We don't trust people to perform. So we try to institute these things. That's a part of the adult is trust. Let's talk about the C and probably the H. Let's do both of those.
Well, I think performance management is such a fantastic example of how you could be more human in your approach, and how currently a lot of what we do is designed around the established ways of doing HR rather than really thinking about how humans actually improve their performance. So I think it's a great way of illustrating the human aspect of the model.
Let's talk about that then.
When we take a step back from performance management in HR and we think about what is it that we were trying to achieve with it, we wanted people to feel more motivation. We wanted them to be able to perform better. And we wanted the vehicle for that to be a conversation between a manager and their team member. And as you say, because we didn't trust managers to do it, we've created this kind of elaborate traditional performance management approach, which typically is set objectives at the start of the year, largely cascaded down through the organization so that even the factory worker or the receptionist can track what their objectives are right back to the chief exec, which is just ridiculous. But we've kind of got that idea. We set them a year in advance, so they're supposed to still be relevant by the end of the year or the mid-year, where we might do a bit of refreshing.
Which necessarily makes them very vague. Or wrong. They're either vague or wrong.
Exactly. And they're wrong because the managers are coming to us and going, have you got a copy of my objectives that I set for my team last year? Because I can't seem to lay my hands on them. If they were driving performance, everybody would know what they were. They tend to be extracurricular stuff as well, don't they? They're not actually your day job. So you go, I feel like I've had a great year doing my day job, but I didn't do these extra projects that became irrelevant by March. Oh, well, we're going to have to mark you down. So, but back to the human aspect. So we didn't trust them to do any of this stuff. So we set objectives at the start of the year, and then we have the annual review discussion, which is guaranteed, if we know anything about human beings, is guaranteed not to improve performance. So you have, first of all, the parental dynamic. So I'm taking you into a room, Dart, I'm sitting you down, and I'm going to say the words, I'm going to give you some feedback, which has the impact on the brain as someone running up behind you at night in a dark alley, immediate shutdown, fight, flight, or freeze. Even if we've got a great relationship and I've been giving you feedback throughout the year, great job, Dart, brilliant, you're still going to react in a way because the dynamic is such that you don't quite know what's coming. From a human perspective, you can only change one behavior at a time. And if you're going to change that behavior, you probably need to be having a discussion with me about it at the point where the behavior is front of mind for you. So when you're in the act of doing it or just after. But what we do is we save up all of this feedback and give it to them all in one lump. And we wouldn't do that with our kids, would we? You see them about to do something and you think, right, well, I'm going to make a note of that and raise it with them in 3 months' time. It's like, of course not. We would deal with it in the moment. So you've got managers who aren't used to doing this because they don't do it very often, giving all of this feedback in a way that actually what we want from our people at this point is to be curious and leaning in and open, and instead they're defensive and anxious and they're shutting down. The idea that we can actually manage someone else's performance, I think, is not reality. You can say to me, Lucy, you need to go to the gym. You can incentivize me to go to the gym. But if I don't want to go to the gym, then actually, am I just going to wander around listening to my podcast and get the hell out of there as soon as I can? If I want to go to the gym, there's nothing you can do that's going to stop me from going. So this idea that it's led by the manager. If you're a manager, you've got 12 people to think about. Are you honestly going to give each one of those a huge amount of time and attention? And then we get to the rating. So it's going to end in a rating. We're going to be having a great conversation maybe. And then I go and Dart, you're a meets expectations, but really that's good. That means good. Or you're a 2 and you go, but I was a 1 last year. So it's still really good, but I was a 1 last year. It's meaningless. Managers are incapable of giving ratings that are consistent, objective and fair, but not because they're bigots or bad human beings, but because they're human. And we know all about rater bias. So for all of these different reasons, ratings, the fact that it's manager-led rather than employee-led by and large, it's not human. It's not based around how human beings can improve their performance. If we want human beings to improve their performance, then the leader is in a coaching role. The employee is driving the conversations, is saying, Dart, I actually need a check-in with you because I'm a bit concerned about this, rather than these set frequencies that, again, we roll out from the center. You must have at least 12 conversations or 6 check-ins or whatever it might be. So I'm leading and driving it as an employee. You're acting as my coach, as my manager, and you are helping me course correct throughout the year without any kind of rating being at the end of it. So I'm really comfortable about saying, I'm not sure I got that bit right, or I think I messed up there. Whereas if you're going to give me a rating, am I going to do that? Probably not. So I'm going on. All of these reasons, it makes no sense that we're trying to get human beings to improve their performance. And yet we've got this paraphernalia, this big set piece of the annual performance evaluation, performance review that isn't driving motivational performance. Now, the good news is, as you know, lots of companies are now changing it. Lots of them are. When I started Disruptive HR, 10 years next year, it was very unusual to find companies who were doing things differently. Many of them are now, and that's great.
There's a couple things you said in there which I thought were really telling. One is, we don't treat people like adults. And then you said, and we wouldn't even treat our kids that way. Right?
Exactly.
So it's someplace farther away from treating people like adults than we could possibly want. Cisco Systems is one of the companies that I worked for. And it's also one of the companies that eliminated traditional performance ratings and turned it into what you recommend, which is continuous and very much at the line manager discretion. And it was a weekly discussion, and it was real time. It was focused on asking people every week, what's working for you and what's not? What do you love? What do you loathe? So it's very much like that.
Yeah, I think Cisco is one of those organizations that's doing some really great stuff. And one of my other favorites is Atlassian. And they have 3 questions, which in these 3 questions, it's basically a performance management system in 3 questions that managers ask each week. What are you working on? How can I help? And how are you feeling? Alignment, manager as coach, thinking about the whole human being. It's a performance management system without all of the stuff. Now, of course, poor managers are not going to do that. They're not going to have that conversation. But then the people who work for these poor managers, are they having a great experience from that annual performance evaluation today? No, they're not. So let's not, in HR, let's not focus so much on them. Let's focus on the ones that might be open to doing things differently.
So there's a few questions I ask at the end of every show. And because you've read the HBR article, you're a little bit prepared for one of them. And the question is, what job do you hire your job to do for you?
This is a really, really interesting question. What I want is for HR professionals to refocus their energies so that they are enabling people to do their best work. I want to help HR people to get to that place where they see that as their primary purpose, enabling people to do their best work.
This falls into one of some 35 responses, which is, I want to help others. But that falls into 2 kinds. One is, I want to help people directly and I want to see the benefit I give them directly. But the second one is, the world's broken, it's out of shape, and I want to put the world into shape so that it does more good for people. And yours sounds like the second one of those, which is, I see something, the world is not working right, and it could work so much better.
Absolutely. It's definitely the second one. We've all had hopefully some positive experiences, but I meet so many people, not in HR, but leaders, employees who describe their experience of being at work. The positive elements are despite the organization. It's not because of the organization. Very rarely is it because of the organization, whether that's them playing to their strengths because they happen to fall into a role, but they weren't recruited, they weren't hired on that basis. Their role wasn't designed around their strengths. They were just lucky, or they were lucky that they've found a team who's incredibly engaged and supportive and collaborative, or they've got a leader and a manager who gives them the autonomy and space to do their best work. But it's not the norm. It's not the norm. And that needs to change.
It's not the norm. It's often homegrown by the team as opposed to being something that is encouraged by the company. Sometimes it is something that is homegrown, even though the company will not recognize it or reward it.
Yeah, absolutely.
It can be accidental, but it could be so much better. What does your job or your work cost you?
Occasionally, it makes me wonder whether I'm having any impact at all. And therefore, to doubt whether it's feasible. But I think this is a long-term agenda. Organizations have been designed and structured, and leadership has been viewed in a particular way, and the HR profession has been viewed in a particular way for so long that these things don't change overnight. And when I look back over the last 10 years of doing this, things have definitely changed. Not because of me, I'm not arrogant enough to assume that, but there is a growing body of people and leaders and HR people who want to do things in different ways. So when I'm having one of my dark nights of the soul, I worry that we've made no impact whatsoever. And then I'll come across somebody who'll say, we've changed this. And the reaction was fantastic. And I feel so much more energized in my job. And those things are worth it.
Yeah, that's one of the things about the design of work as a product is that I've talked about this on the show before, which is that some products, they have a detect, which makes it clear that you've completed an action, and it's very satisfying. This pen, when I click the top on, tells me I'm done. If you design a pen where it just sort of the cap mushes on, it doesn't feel like it's done. And that's a design flaw of the product work. And so the challenge of doing the kind of work that you do is that it is so broad that it's, in fact, all world system changing work. I'm going to say world system changing work is always going to come to some extent at the cost of the detect. If you were out there giving somebody a plate of food who was hungry, you'd see it and they'd say thank you. But when you're changing the world, it's hard to tell. And it's one of those things that not all products can have every feature that you want because some of those, they're antagonistic with each other. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So where can people learn more about you and where can they learn more about your work?
Well, we have obviously a website. Contact us at disruptivehr.com. And we've got loads of free resources and diagnostics and all sorts of great stuff that's free for people if they want to go and check it out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Oh, Dart, it's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.